All right, well, welcome everyone today to our webinar, Selective Mutism and Reluctant Speakers, Practical Strategies for School Professionals. Our presenters today are Dr. Alex DiGiacomo, Dr. Tamara Sally, and Dr. Rosalind Catchpole. My name is Michelle Horn, and I'm the Program Manager for the BC Children's Kelty Mental Health Resource Center. I'll also be the moderator today. Before we begin, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the land on which I am joining this webinar from today is the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I also wanted to provide a very brief overview of the Kelty Mental Health Resource Center. So we're a provincial mental health and substance use resource center. We help families across BC by helping with understanding and navigating the mental health system, listening and offering peer support by trained parent peer support workers through a collaboration with Family Smart, and connecting families to resources and tools. We also offer a number of resources and events for school professionals, which you can find in the school professional section of our website. As you know, the webinar today is for school professionals. I just wanted to highlight that we do have another webinar coming up on this same topic this Thursday, May 20th, for parents and caregivers. There's still room to register at the link you can see here on this slide. My colleague will also post this link in the chat. Please pass it along to families you know who may be interested. And a few housekeeping notes before we get started. So attendees are automatically muted and your cameras are turned off, so we can't see or hear you. You don't need to worry about that. If you have any questions for the speakers, please submit those to the Q&A function that you can see at the bottom of your screen. And there has been an option enabled where you can vote for questions that you would like answered, as well as an option for you to ask your questions anonymously. Please submit any technical questions, such as having issues with audio or video, or comments to the chat function. At the end of the webinar, a survey will pop up that we really encourage you to complete. It really helps us in planning for future webinars. A PDF of the slides is currently available at the link that you see on the slide here. It was also emailed out to you in the reminder email you received earlier today, and we'll also include a link in the follow-up email that you'll receive tomorrow. The webinar is being recorded, and it will be made available at the same link that you see on the slide here. It'll be available in the next 2 to 3 days, and we'll also email this link out to you. We also just wanted to note that the information in this webinar applies to the context in British Columbia. So if you're from another jurisdiction, please consult local health and school authorities for further information. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Dr. Alex DiGiacomo is a postdoctoral fellow in the Mood and Anxiety Disorders Clinic at BC Children's Hospital and the Department of Psychiatry at UBC. She is also a psychology associate at the Cornerstone Child and Family Psychology Clinic. She provides clinical services to children, youth, and families, and conducts research to better understand anxiety disorders. Dr. Alex has a particular interest in supporting skillful and confident parenting and in equipping children to conquer fears and challenges. Dr. Tamara Sally is a child and adolescent psychiatrist working in the Mood and Anxiety Disorders Clinic at BC Children's, as well as this physician lead for child and youth psychiatry in Richmond. She also works in the Early Childhood Mental Health Program in Richmond, the Richmond School Program, and the Child and Adolescent Program in Richmond. She is a clinical instructor in the Department of Psychiatry at UBC. She has a strong interest in anxiety disorders in children and youth, as well as in infant psychiatry. And finally, Dr. Rosalind Catchpole is a registered psychologist and head of the Mood and Anxiety Disorders Clinic at BC Children's. She is actively involved in treatment, teaching, and research on anxiety disorders, and has a particular interest in parent-led treatment approaches, including those for school refusal. She recently worked with the Canadian Mental Health Association to develop the Confident Parents Thriving Kids Anxiety Program. She has also worked with Anxiety Canada to develop educational materials. She is a clinical instructor in the Department of Psychiatry at UBC and a director of Cornerstone Child and Family Psychology Clinic. So thank you so much to all of our speakers for taking the time to present on this important topic today. I'll now pass it over to you, Dr. Catchpole.
Thanks so much, Michelle. We're so happy to be here and grateful for your presence. Before we get started, we just wanted to acknowledge with immense gratitude that we live, work, and play on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And professionally, we wanted to take a minute to acknowledge several amazing people who've really helped us along the way in terms of our thinking and treatment approach to selective mutism. And this includes Dr. Stephen Kurtz, who developed the model that we use, Dr. Annie Simpson, who was instrumental in bringing that model to Vancouver, as well as our dear colleagues at Children's Hospital, Dr. Susan Baer, Dr. Janet Ma, Dr. Megan McFadden, and our dear late friend, Dr. Jane Garland. So I wanted to just get started by telling you a little bit about what we're going to cover today. So we're going to talk about the theoretical underpinnings of selective mutism, so you have a better sense of what it is and what it isn't. We're going to give you some really practical strategies that you can use in the school context to help children warm up and find their voices. And finally, we're going to give you a roadmap for how to increase speech in different settings and situations at school. And we'll leave a few minutes at the end for Q&A. But first, we wanted to give you such a heartfelt thanks. This year in particular, we are just so grateful, as we are always, for our educators and the wonderful job that you do to support children. And so our goal in giving this webinar is to support you, to be able to support the reluctant speakers in your schools.
Selective mutism is an anxiety disorder. It describes children who are able to speak comfortably and well in certain settings or with certain people, but they're unable to speak in other settings or with specific people. Parents will often say to us, my child talks nonstop at home, I can't get them to be quiet. And then the minute we step on the school playground, they stop talking, they freeze, they won't even speak to me, let alone anyone there. Children with selective mutism have a range of personalities, just as children without selective mutism do. Some can be boisterous and bossy at home, others are quieter. It can really vary. And in this way, there's also a difference in the sense that some parents might know their child has selective mutism. Other parents might be surprised to find that out when their child goes to school for the first time. Selective mutism is different than shyness. Shy children might be reluctant to talk in a new setting like a birthday party and take a few hours to warm up. Or when they first start school, they might take a little bit of time to get to speaking to other kids or to the teachers. With selective mutism, the child doesn't actually start speaking as the months to years go on, depending on the progress of their disorder. And so we don't diagnose it in the first month of being at school. It's also not related to a language disorder or just learning the language for the first time. For example, children who move to a country and are unable to speak the language. It used to be thought that selective mutism was related to trauma or abuse, but research has shown that children with selective mutism are no more likely to have experienced trauma or abuse than children without selective mutism. As well, children with selective mutism are not trying to be oppositional or difficult or to manipulate adults. Certainly they can be oppositional just as all children can, but this isn't more common in children with selective mutism. Selective mutism really is a form of anxiety where they are quite frozen. They are not trying to be difficult or to make life harder for them or for others. And as I said, it's not just a form of shyness in that it won't go away as the child gets more accustomed to their environment. It tends to persist for really months into years, depending on the severity. Selective mutism affects just under 1% of children. That means that for most classroom teachers, they may not encounter it until every few years goes by. It's a little bit more common in girls than in boys, and it's also higher in children who learn English as a second language or who were a little bit late to acquire language, which makes sense because when they're quite young, if language is harder for them and they're uncomfortable with speech demands, they're going to be more likely to avoid talking or to freeze in those situations. The usual age of onset for selective mutism is between 2 and 4. This is when kids first start to leave home and join community music classes or preschool or daycare, and parents start to realize that their little chatterbox at home is not talking in these new environments. The average age of intervention, however, is a few years later, between 6 to 8. And that's important to know because by the time an elementary school teacher notices that a child has selective mutism and points it out to the parent or intervention is put into place, that child may not have been talking already for a number of years and have had a lot of time practicing the non-talking response. There's many reasons it's important to identify selective mutism early and to start the intervention process early as well. Selective mutism affects children's social, emotional, and academic progress, as well as safety concerns that can arise in the school setting. Emotionally, kids learn to self-regulate by expressing their emotions, identifying how they feel, being able to say, I felt really mad when that boy took my toy, or I feel really sad that my mom dropped me off today, or that my hamster died, or whatever it might be that happens in their lives. And when children can't identify and label their emotions, there may be a delay in their emotional regulation skills. The same applies to social skills. Children learn to interact with other kids by negotiating turn taking, coming up with ideas of what to play with, making friends, keeping friends, sharing ideas with friends. So for children with selective mutism, a number of years can go by where they aren't practicing the language-based social skills that they need. And so even when intervention takes place and children with selective mutism start talking, they may be quite behind in this area. Academically, we've had many teachers tell us it can be hard to assess children with selective mutism because the child won't read out loud or answer questions or ask questions or do show and tell or other things where a teacher can assess their progress at school. This can be very frustrating for everyone involved, and children with delays in their academic progress may be later to be identified. As well, much of the learning process is a participation aspect where children ask the questions that they need answers to, or they talk about areas of interest for them. So their academic progress is often affected by their selective mutism. In terms of safety, it's really important for a child to have one person at the very least that they can speak to at school. And we have had a patient who fell at recess time, for example, and broke their arm, but wasn't able to tell anyone until they got home from school that day. So being able to intervene early so children have at least one adult in the school setting that they can go to if they're in physical or emotional distress is really important. The good news is that selective mutism is very treatable. It's one of the most fun disorders that we treat at BC Children's Hospital. And we can see a child come in not speaking at all, and within a few weeks running around our hallways asking questions to all kinds of people that they've never met before. So it's important that we remember how hopeful this treatment is, and that with early intervention especially, children can get much better.
Thanks, Dr. Sally. And yeah, that's very true, that kids most often do get better. And actually, helping students to find their voice can be a really rewarding thing. But let me read you what one educator had to say. She said, "It's been an amazing experience working with Dr. Catchpole. My student is selectively mute and has not spoken to anyone at the school for many years. We were able to have him begin speaking with one of his teachers, then to several teaching staff, and then to the students in his class, where we played a game in a circle of peers and ended with a fun conversation among the group. The student progressed from fearing speaking to others to smiling, having fun, and asking others questions. What began as a potentially threatening experience turned out to be the time of the week that the student looked forward to the most. Seeing the student benefit from this intervention has been very rewarding for me as an educator." So we wanted to make a point about this because we realized that if you've never heard these kinds of success stories before, you might genuinely feel unsure about whether things can actually get better. And so, like Dr. Sally was saying, we want to reassure you that we've seen many, many kids really take off with their brave talking. Okay, so if you're watching this, there's probably a student in your school who is struggling to find their voice. We've developed a 5-step framework to help kind of guide your intervention, and we'll go through each of these 5 steps in turn, starting with identifying and exploring the struggle, understanding the maintenance factors, setting the stage for success, preparing the toolkit and actually using the SM skills, and then finally communicating and checking in. Okay, so we're hoping to bring this all to life a bit by weaving in a case example, who we'll refer to as Sam. So really Sam is a compilation of the kids we've seen over the years. And what you need to know about him is that he's a 5-year-old Chinese-Canadian boy who lives with his parents and his older sister. Sam is fluent in both Mandarin and English. And so what Sam's kindergarten teacher has noticed is that he hasn't spoken in the classroom at all, not to her, not to other kids, and he's defaulted to kind of communicating by nodding or pointing. The other thing that's important to know about Sam, and you'll find out later on why these are important little nuggets to find out, is that he loves running around, he loves playing with bugs, and his favorite candy are Skittles and M&Ms. Okay, so step 1, identify and explore the struggle. Like Dr. Sally kind of alluded to earlier, as educators, you're in this unique position where you might actually some of the time be the first people in the child's life who kind of notice that there's a problem. And the family may actually have no idea that there are any talking concerns because the child is doing well at home, they're doing well in the community. So when you begin having concerns, the first step is really to talk with the caregivers because you want to understand, are they aware of how little the child is speaking at school? Is the level of communication that you're seeing at the school different to that is displayed at home? Does this child already have a diagnosis of selective mutism? If they don't, you might consider starting contact with the family doctor. But really, this is the part where you kind of want to get a sense for what the child's true communication style is. So what we find really helpful is getting parents or caregivers to send a video kind of showcasing them when they're in a comfortable place so that you kind of know what you're shooting for in the school setting. The other thing to do would be to talk with the child's previous teachers and anyone else at the school who has a relationship with them to really suss out, okay, who is this child most comfortable with? Have they spoken to anybody? How much are they speaking? That kind of thing. All right, so step 2 is to understand the maintenance factors. In other words, understand what is it that is keeping this SM going. So one of the key concepts here is this idea that no one likes to see a kid looking anxious or distressed. I mean, maybe some people do, but since you're all educators and you've dedicated your careers to supporting kids, I'll bet that you're not in that small group. And think about it. Think about the last time that you saw a kid feeling distressed. You probably felt a pull to help them or to rescue them from whatever was scary or upsetting. And if you felt that, that's normal. That's just how we're wired. It's a really instinctual pull. And by the way, everybody does this. It's not just adults. Before COVID, when I used to go into schools, there would always be another child who would say, oh, don't talk to that kid because they don't speak. So this kind of pull happens with kids, teachers, mental health professionals, strangers, everybody. And in the specific context of SM, what this pull to rescue can look like is jumping in to answer for the child, allowing the child to communicate non-verbally with nods or head shakes, mind reading. So trying to figure out ahead of time what they might want to save them from the distress of having to express themselves. Or, like I said before, preemptively kind of telling people, okay, don't try to talk to them because they're just shy, they don't talk. The problem is that when we respond by rescuing, although it may actually comfort the child in the short term, in fact, it very likely will comfort the child in the short term, it actually increases anxiety in the long term. So although it's very instinctual to help kids avoid their fears, it's not actually helpful. We do know what is helpful though, and we know that one of the keys to reducing anxiety and fostering bravery is to support kids in approaching and facing their fears in a really validating and planful way. So let's put this another way. Let me explain how we kind of conceptualize this cycle of not speaking. So let's say you're with your small child at the grocery store and you run into an old friend and maybe who hasn't ever met your child, and the friend says, oh my goodness, there's your kid, what's your name? And then, your child is getting anxious, they're not really talking, they're avoiding, and then you wait a couple seconds and the awkward moment doesn't pass, and then so someone jumps in and you might say, oh, this is Sam, or this is whoever. And then once you do that, once you're kind of prompted to do that, both your anxiety and the child's anxiety go down. They go down. And after several cycles of this is essentially a negative reinforcement cycle, which basically teaches kids that in order for their anxiety to go down, they need to just not answer and keep avoiding. And so the selective mutism intervention, it happens between these two orange boxes. This is where all of the magic happens. So between the child getting anxious and the child avoiding. So really what the whole point of the intervention is to break that habit of not answering and of avoiding. So Dr. Kurtz, who does a lot of SM work, he did this calculation and he figured out somehow that in a typical school year, kids might get asked over 100,000 questions. And if you can imagine all of those going unanswered, that is a lot of practice not answering questions. And so really, not speaking that we see in selective mutism, it's like an overlearned behavior, because if you practice anything 100,000 times, you get very good at it. Okay, so we know now that in order to improve anxiety, in order to make it go down, in order to help kids with brave talking, we need to get them to face the hard thing. But knowing that and doing that are two separate things. And we thought it was really important to actually acknowledge that this is hard to do. When you care about kids and you see them distressed, it's hard sometimes to push them. And inevitably, you might have some worries or thoughts about this. So it's totally normal to think, oh man, what if I push them too hard? What if I'm traumatizing them? That's all normal. The other thing that's normal is for kids to feel anxious when people are asking them to practice brave talking. So expect some distress. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It just means that it's hard. And what we know, what we're very confident about, is that when you have an appropriate plan in place, it's not harmful to encourage kids to face their fears. And actually, it's the best thing for them. The other thing we know from experience and from research is that confidence really does increase with each step. So as best you can, and you will not do this perfectly because none of us do, try not to let kids off the hook by communicating nonverbally. Okay, step 3. So now we're thinking about how do we set the stage for success? First thing is we need to gather the school team. So there are 2 main roles for the school team. Number 1 is like the coach. So the job of the coach is kind of to coordinate the intervention and figure out the next move. Then there's another role of we like to call it the quarterback. We don't know much about this sport, but we hope that this works. The quarterback is to establish speech with the student if it hasn't been established already, and then to transfer that speech to others, so to pass the ball to others. And this can be the same person that does these 2 roles, but what we find is that it's often 2 because this is a lot of work. It's a lot of work, so sometimes it's nice to have 2 people in these roles. Okay, the second piece related to setting the stage for success is all about communicating with family. And as educators, we know that you're very skilled at this, and you know how to just naturally offer hope that things can get better and validate family struggles. So that would be the first piece of this. The second piece is just introducing this idea of a stepwise plan that can help children find their voice, because sometimes parents have no idea that this is actually possible. So you're the ones that are going to introduce this to them. And you might want to tell them that in the beginning, especially if the child isn't speaking to anyone at the school, they may be needed to transfer speech to an educator. The other key piece here is educating families about the importance of consistent external reinforcers. These can be stickers, points, whatever. Just to note, these are not a long-term kind of solution. So there's no indication that these will be needed for years and years and years. This is just to kickstart the process, and they're a very short-term kind of tool to build momentum. We've had a lot of success actually with using a Brave book. So using part of the child's agenda to kind of write down their Brave steps for the day, and then the child brings that home and exchanges it for some kind of reward. The point is, though, that intervening for SM is a team sport. And what all 3 of us have seen is that the times that are most successful are the times when communication is happening well, in a well-coordinated way, and is happening frequently.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. DiGiacomo. Preparation and planning is just so helpful with selective mutism. And so what you've heard already is really kind of how to set the stage, the things you want to know before you get going with your intervention. And now I'm going to talk about what does that actually look like? What helps these kids? And in particular, I'm going to talk about two really key skills, which is how to help a kid warm up and how to encourage them to brave talk. And then we'll talk about how to put that into place. So some things to think about beforehand. When it comes to warm up, it's really helpful to have a few things in place. So first of all, you need a quiet space and some time. This might be the resource room or a different quiet room in the school, or sometimes it's even outside. But this is not the kind of thing you want to be doing, obviously, in a busy classroom. The second piece is you need a bit of a hook. You need something that the child is really interested in that's going to help get them motivated to do this work. And so this varies from child to child. You can speak with caregivers or the child's classroom teacher to find this out. Things that we often use would be things like, doing a drawing activity or a craft with the child, building blocks or Jenga or Lego or cars, or even sometimes just exploring something outside. The other part of your toolkit that you're going to want to have when you work with reluctant talkers or kids with selective mutism are some brave talking tools. So as Dr. DiGiacomo mentioned, you want to have some reinforcers that you can use when the child is speaking. And these could be points or stickers or candy, points in a Brave book that are exchanged for prizes at home. And I'll just take a minute to make the point that we're well aware of the research on intrinsic motivation. And sometimes there can be an understandable sort of hesitancy about using rewards when you're working with kids on their talking. And I just wanted to say, having worked with literally hundreds of kids with SM, my almost universal experience has been that those rewards really can make a difference, particularly in the early stages. And I've yet to meet a kid where the intrinsic motivation didn't take over eventually. It's fun to talk to other kids and it's fun to be able to, tell your teacher things. So this really is a temporary bridge. And the way I personally like to think about this is that anxiety gets in the way of intrinsic motivation sometimes. And I've literally had kids sort of freeze a little bit when I ask them a question and kind of look over to the candy and then look back and give me an answer. The other thing you're going to want are some games that facilitate talking. And so this is usually in the resource room or maybe in the classroom. But the idea is games are fun. They distract from the anxiety. They take the attention off the kid. And so we shared a few here on the slides that we really like. Spot It is my absolute favorite. It's small and portable, and it's a fun one for lots of ages. But literally anything can be turned into a talking game. The third set of tools you want in your toolkit are some activities that work for what we call talking quests. So this would be the child going around the school to ask some questions, or maybe going around the classroom to ask some questions of different people. And you'll see on the next couple slides, we've got a couple examples of what this might look like. So first we have what we call a brave talking survey, which is just a way to ask other kids questions in a structured way, or have other children ask the kid with SM a question. So things like, do you have a sister or no sister? Do you like pizza or sushi better? Another thing is to have a bit of a talking scavenger hunt. So the goal might be to find someone who has 3 brothers by asking them, or find a kid who likes to eat anchovies. That might be really hard. Find a child who's lived in another country. But essentially just some structured activities that get the talking going. So now that you've got your toolkit ready, let's talk about how to actually do this. So there's 2 skills you're going to use when you're working with kids with SM as you help them to work up their ladder, which I'm going to talk about later. Skill number 1 is warm up. So the only goal of warm up is to get the child comfortable and to build that relationship with you without asking questions. And this is actually kind of hard. If you think about it for a minute as an educator, if you're getting to know a student, one of the main ways we do that as mental health professionals too, is by asking them questions, right? Do you have any pets at home? Or do you like to draw? those are lovely shoes. Are they new? Like, so we ask kids questions as a way of showing that we care and we're interested in them. The trouble is for kids with SM, questions elicit anxiety. And so what we want to do is build that relationship without introducing that anxiety-provoking stage of asking questions. And so the way to do this is to start with a child-led activity. Think back to your toolkit slide for Warmup. So for Sam, for example, he loves bugs. Perfect. We're going to look for bugs together, right? That might just be the child-led activity that we start with. And instead of saying to Sam, whoa, is that a worm? Instead, we just want to describe what he's doing. So you want to describe, oh, you're picking up that wiggly worm so carefully. We want to praise. I love the way you're looking for all those bugs. I didn't even know there were so many bugs in the sandbox. You want to imitate what the child's doing. So you also want to be going looking for bugs. And you want to genuinely enjoy and have fun. If Sam happens to speak during this, which some kids with milder SM will do, you want to repeat anything that he says. So if he says it's an ant, you want to say it's an ant. And these skills, which are adapted from parent-child interaction therapy, really work beautifully in helping to build that connection. And you want to do this long enough. Sometimes it's just 10 minutes, sometimes it's longer, until the child's starting to look a bit more relaxed, right? So until the shoulders have come down, you're getting a few smiles, and they're looking less frozen. But we don't just stop there, because we can get kids comfortable and feeling safe with us, but if we don't also work on talking, then we're not actually accomplishing the goal that we set out to. So what we know from research on this topic, and our SLP colleagues are amazing at this, is that all questions aren't created equal. So the type of question really increases the chance that a child's going to respond verbally. And most of the time, a forced choice question that gives a child two options is actually the most likely to produce a verbal response. So for Sam, we might ask him, well, that's so cool. Is that a worm or a caterpillar? Or do you like chocolate or broccoli better if we're on a different topic? But essentially, we want to just give two options because it narrows down the field. It doesn't, it kind of decreases anxiety because they've heard the answers and there's only two to choose from. But it's also really hard to nod when you ask that. Open-ended questions are sometimes a little bit harder for kids, but they also encourage more speech. So they're good to incorporate in your intervention plans as you get a little further along. So for Sam, for example, we might ask, which one is your favorite bug? Or we might, as we're talking with him, say, what did you do this weekend? We try to stay away from yes/no questions because they're almost guaranteed to get a kid to nod or shake their head if they have SM. So if we say to Sam, whoa, look, I found a bug. Do you like this one? He's going to go. Now, you will ask yes/no questions. We all do it, and it's okay. But what we would really encourage you to do is to say, I see that you're nodding your head. Does that mean yes or something different? We really want to focus on the words. Sometimes I'll sort of make a little joke with kids and say, I see you're moving your neck up and down, but I'm not a neck doctor. I'm a words doctor. So what with your words, what's your answer? The other key skill that's really important in this area is wait time. So kids with SM are kind of used to adults asking them questions that they aren't really going to get answered and that the adult moves on. So we want to give a good 5-second wait time because it shows that we're expecting a response. And because when we're anxious, it slows down our processing. So giving a good 5-second wait actually lets the child have a bit of time to think about what they're going to say. We think about trying to get closer and closer to just talking to a new person. So what that means is if you ask Sam a question and he doesn't answer, you want to think about what's a slightly easier step. So this might be rephrasing a question. So if we've asked Sam, what's your favorite bug in the whole world? And he doesn't answer, we might rephrase it into a forced choice question. We might say, do you like butterflies better or ants better? If that's too hard, which it often is at the beginning, you want a plan C. So this is where we alluded to the fact that you want a caregiver there maybe at the beginning. So you can say to Sam, tell your mom what your favorite bug is. right? And you might even need to, plan D might be that you go farther away and have Sam tell his mom. And I will just make one note. Hopefully things are much back to normal soon, but I have done a lot of work on Zoom or Microsoft Teams this year with kids. So if we're in a situation where it's harder to have caregivers in the school building, this can be done virtually as well. The goal is just to get closer and closer to normal speech. Now, next would be, what do you do once the child has answered? So even if Sam answers to his mom, 8 feet away from you and you can't even hear it, we want mom to repeat what Sam said, and then we want to repeat it again. So I say, oh, you like butterflies. That's so cool. Thank you for telling me that, Sam. So you praise him. You've earned another candy, or you've earned another sticker in your Brave book. And what that does is just really highlights that it's great that they're talking. And practically speaking, if you're working with a peer, for example, it might be that the child is quite quiet and the peer can't actually hear what was said. But if you repeat it, you're kind of acting like a microphone. And that helps even the other peer's sense of like, oh, this child is talking. Okay, so now that those are the basic skills, and then what we wanted to do was talk a little bit more generally about what we call this fade-in principle. And I'm going to go over this sort of in general on this slide, and then we've actually got a couple of concrete examples for you on the next couple slides. So the idea of the fade-in principle is really predicated on the simple but radical notion that these kids know how to talk. It's the where that's the problem. So we know Sam, for example, talks with his mom. It's extremely rare to have a child that's fully mute, like almost unheard of. And so the problem isn't that Sam doesn't know how to talk. The problem is that he's nervous to talk in certain situations. And so what we use is we have the person the child talks to comfortably. Let's say it's usually a parent. That person establishes speech with the child, and the new person literally slowly gets closer and closer. Right? So they might come say hi, they might pop by, they might sit a few feet away. And the goal is that the child is still speaking to that first person. And then once that's happened and everyone's kind of together, it would be time for the new person, let's say, to ask a question and then go from there. And once the speech is established with the new person, that's when the first person can kind of fade out. So we sort of think of fading in and fading out, almost like you're turning up the brightness on a screen, or you're turning up the brightness on your presence. And this skill, in combination with the warm-up and the specific types of questions, is often very, very effective. So let's use a really concrete example. So let's talk about Sam, and let's say that Sam and his mom are going to be alone on the schoolyard, and that our goal is that we get speech transferred to the resource teacher. And just to say, we've worked with all sorts of school professionals, SLPs, counselors, EAs, classroom teachers, So this really, can be anyone who has the time and cares about this kid. But let's say it's the resource teacher. So the keys to remember on this ladder, we literally think of this like climbing stairs or climbing a ladder. The key is you only move on to the next step if the child is still talking. The other point to remember is the pacing will vary. Sometimes we can do this whole set of steps in 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Other times this might be 5 separate sessions with a child. And then, of course, last, just to make the obvious clear, the goals and steps will vary. So some kids speak to peers, no problem, and we're just working on adults. Other times it might be the opposite. So you want to think about like, what's our next goal? And then, as you'll see on the bottom, you need your prizes. So for this one, we're going to use some Skittles and M&Ms. So bottom left corner, Sam, Alex, Sam and his mom are alone on the schoolyard looking for bugs. The resource teacher pops over briefly, says hi, and then sits maybe at a farther away picnic table. Not hiding, by the way, like the child is aware that they're there. Sam continues to talk, so the resource teacher comes closer and sits within earshot, maybe doing some work so they don't appear to be paying too much attention. Sam continues to talk, so the resource teacher comes and sits with Sam and mom and has some nice sanitized M&Ms. Not sanitized, wrapped. Don't Lysol the M&Ms. If that goes well, mom tells the resource teacher to ask Sam if he just found a ladybug or a squirrel. Resource teacher and mom wait 5 seconds. Let's say Sam doesn't answer. So he goes a little further away. Mom says, oh, come over here and tell me, Sam. He answers. He immediately gets praised, rewards, and then another question is attempted. And often fairly quickly, you can move from answering to mom, getting closer and closer to the resource teacher. Once the speech is established with the resource teacher, mom says, oh, I got to make a phone call. You guys keep playing. And the speech can continue with the resource teacher. So it really is this slow baton passing. And if we look on the next slide, what we'll see is that it's actually an almost identical process where now instead of mom, the person who is the comfortable speaking partner is the resource teacher, and the new person we're trying to work on is the classroom teacher. And so same thing, we don't want to change too much at once. So if it went really well looking for bugs the first time, we might do looking for bugs again. But this time it's the resource teacher and Sam, and then the classroom teacher is slowly fading in until Sam can speak in front of her or him. And then classroom teacher will start asking questions. Sam may need to go a little further away to start, but then once he's speaking to classroom teacher, then resource teacher can fade out. And again, he's continuing to earn prizes. So one last one is just to quickly mention, if we're working on Sam talking to a peer, what we might want to do, for example, is have Sam be playing Spot It with his resource teacher in the resource room or in another quiet location at school. And then once that's been happening comfortably and his voice is nice and warmed up, the resource teacher would say, Sam, we're going to invite a friend to come play. And so the friend would come, the resource teacher or other school professional, forgive me to those of you who are not resource teachers, some lovely educator is going to do some warm-up skills with Sam and the friend, maybe some drawing or playing with blocks, and then is going to explain how to play Spot It. And then the Spot It game will start. Sometimes, again, Sam might need to go a little further away to start, but that usually goes pretty well. They play a Spot It game. Everybody's earning points or candy or something like that. And then after the game, it might be time to pull in one of those like talking quest activities we talked about. So something like a brave talking survey or, you know, a people bingo kind of thing where there's some more structured Q&A. And then we work on Q&A between Sam and the peer. So this is just a few examples, hopefully, to get you started. There's lots to this, but the same principles really apply. Okay, so a few tips for success, and then I'll pass it over to Dr. Sally. So these are just a few things we've learned over the years that we wanted to share with you so you can learn them more quickly than we did. The first would be don't underestimate the value of momentum. So there's this natural sense of like, oh, this is pretty hard for the child to speak. I'll only ask them a couple questions, let's say in our 30 minutes we have together. But actually, more often than not, momentum is amazing. It's much easier for the child to answer the 20th question than it is for them to answer the first. And so actually going quickly with a game that requires lots of answers often helps their anxiety come down more quickly. Second tip would be remember the brave talking ladder, right? So you always want to be thinking about what should we do next? And we want to work on new goals wherever we can. Changing only one thing at a time. So don't throw a kid in with a bunch of new kids and a new place and a new game they've never played. We try to change only one thing at a time. And that's what keeps their anxiety usually manageable so that we can work on things. But it might be that you bring in a new peer each time, let's say, when we're working on game playing. The third tip would be, especially for those kids who get a bit frozen, movement and silliness are magic. So we will sometimes invent little games where kids have to run around or you know, go touch the tree and run back. And that just helps decrease that physiological anxiety. The fourth tip would be engage the caregivers. So if a child, let's say, is now speaking a bit to their classroom teacher, and maybe the step on the ladder this week is that every day when they come in, the teacher's going to ask them, I don't know what they had for breakfast or something. Caregivers can help by practicing that on the way to school. So they can remind the child, remember, you know, Mr. So-and-so is going to ask you what you had for breakfast. And remember, you had cereal today. So when he says, what did you have for breakfast? You're going to say, I had cereal. So that can just help support the child. The fifth tip would be, if you get stuck, change your course, go outside and run around a little bit, or maybe try a different game, but try not to get stuck in allowing the child to just respond nonverbally. And my last tip for you is be kind to yourself. It takes a lot of energy and it can be hard work, especially at the beginning. And no one does this perfectly. I do not do this perfectly, even after years and years. And as long as you do this reasonably well with a good heart, it typically goes really well.
Thank you, Dr. Catchpole. For this slide, it's a reminder again to really think through getting caregivers into the loop as early as possible. When the school team and the caregivers work together, the whole process is so much more smooth. For example, if you want a child to work on doing show and tell in a class, having them practice at home with mom and dad or with aunts and uncles several times will make it more likely that they're going to be successful when they get to school and give it a go. So try and set up a regular communication system with caregivers to let them know what you're working on at school and what you want them to practice at home with the child. Another important piece is try to find time. I know everyone's busy, but try if you can to find time to meet together as a school team and troubleshoot any barriers coming up early. For example, Sam wouldn't talk to his classroom teacher, but will talk to the resource teacher. That would be an issue to identify early on if several attempts have failed at fading in the classroom teacher, and trying to think creatively on how to overcome that together. Another reason to meet together as a school team is to make sure that progress is happening in the way that you want it to. Every month or so, you'd like to see the child taking a couple of steps up the ladder. So if a month or two goes by and the child is still stuck at the same step on the ladder, for example, they have not faded in any new peers or they haven't spoken to any new teachers, then it's definitely time to sit down and see what's going on and if external help needs to be brought into place at that point. So these are some key benchmarks of when you might want to reach out and get help outside of the school team. So like I had said, if a child is stuck at the same step on the ladder despite several good attempts to get them to move forwards, that's a good time to reach out. Or physically, we sometimes see children that are very frozen. They look like they're glued onto their desk seat, not moving. They can't even pick up their hand or move their body. Those children with severe physical freeze response probably need external help earlier than the ones that are a little bit more comfortable in their bodies. We like to say give it 4 to 6 solid attempts where you've set up the child in an environment for success and brought in all the skills and tools that you've planned on using with them before you might say, okay, we're not making progress, let's reach out. And for older students, certainly we know that if they've had that many years practicing not talking, reaching out earlier makes more sense. Working with a child in kindergarten is much easier and you're much more likely to get traction than a child in grade 8, for example. So for an older child with SM, please reach out earlier. And then where to reach out. So there's 3 places in the public system where parents and families and caregivers can reach out for help. The first one is the local child and youth mental health team. So every district should have one of these, and it's a self-referred program. What that means is the family and the caregivers do not have to go to their family doctor to get a referral to the child and youth mental health team. They can just call and make an appointment and self-refer to that team to get help for their child's selective mutism. And the link is attached on this slide. Another option for families and caregivers is to go to their family doctor and ask for a referral to a pediatrician. This would be another great resource for families to get the help they need. And if a child has severe selective mutism or is older and there's other complicating factors, often children are referred to the Mood and Anxiety Disorders Clinic where we work at BC Children's Hospital. And that referral, again, has to come from the family doctor or the pediatrician. So the take-home messages, thanks for listening for all of this. And there's so much new skills that we've talked about today, but hopefully these take-home messages will stay with you. One is to intervene as early as possible because it just is so much more treatable the faster the intervention takes place. The second piece is remembering the warm-up process. I always struggled with this myself. I like to get just right into the actual work. And Dr. Catchpole always had to remind me, remember to warm up. So spending those few minutes warming up the child, as impatient as it can be to get to the actual talking part, is really important. And then remembering as well to fade in new people with the step-by-step strategy described here to ensure success for the child. expect that you're going to feel a little bit of anxiety when you first start to do this. I still feel anxiety, but if you can try and fake some confidence and playfulness, it will go a lot better with the children, as that can be quite contagious for them. And overall, we want you to walk away today remembering that selective mutism is very treatable. There's every reason to be hopeful. It can feel difficult to get started with it or overwhelming, but on the whole, children want to be able to talk with their friends and in their classes. So they will move along. It might be more slowly for some kids or faster for others, but they will move along if you're consistent with the intervention. And we've just added some resources here. In particular, I'd like to highlight the Understanding and Managing Selective Mutism YouTube video, which is the third blue link there, which is a 10-minute video which really goes through the skills and how they can be used with a child who has selective mutism. So for anyone that's a more visual learner, this video is a great way to kind of summarize much of what we talked about today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sally, Dr. DiGiacomo, and Dr. Catchpole, such tangible, practical strategies that you presented today. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions. We have quite a few in the Q&A, so I think we'll just jump right in so that we can get to as many as possible. So we actually had a number of questions from educators who are curious about resources and strategies for older children and teens. So for example, an educator who is saying that we're a secondary school, a 15-year-old student is coming here next year with selective mutism. Could you please help with some older resources too? And then another educator who has a grade 7 student where stickers and brave talk isn't really appropriate for them. So suggestions for that older child or for teens. Yeah, Dr. Catchpole?
So I'm happy to start, and then Dr. DiGiacomo, Dr. Sally, please jump in. So thank you for this question, first of all, because selective mutism is much more rare in teens, but it does exist. And it's even more important at that age to make sure we've got a good coordinated team and that these kids get, an appropriate amount of support. I'll say a few things. One is it's invariably more complicated at that age. So making sure that there is some external mental health support, which might include some psychiatric support or even medication in some cases, is really, really important. It's challenging to do this just on your own without some extra support. The next thing I'll say, we could do a whole webinar on teens and SM, but generally speaking, the principles are the same, but the way we deliver them is a bit different. So when I work with teens, I do that psychoeducation that we just gave you guys about what is SM, sort of what's a not speaking cycle. I do that with teens first off the bat, so that they understand kind of why it's so hard for them to speak. It takes away the blame. And I talk a bit about what the treatment process looks like. So we talk about starting with easier situations and moving on to harder situations. Candy is actually highly effective for teens, it turns out. We don't call it brave talking, but in all seriousness, rewards are helpful. And working with parents to kind of figure out, is this child motivated by, some money for a video game they like, or, do they want a Subway gift card or something like that, can actually be really helpful. And the nice thing about working with teens is not always, but sometimes they're actually motivated. They, more so than little ones who are a bit oblivious sometimes. And being able to set up that stepwise plan is really helpful. A couple of things. So some teens, and actually we do this for kids sometimes too, are willing to make videos of themselves as a first step, or audio recordings, rather than sort of speaking live in that new situation. So that can be a helpful first step for kids of all age, actually, but in particular, I use it for teens. I often have a teen leave me a voicemail as a first step of like, what's something that you like. I think the challenge in high schools, and you educators will know this better than we do, is when kids are in sort of a more traditional high school setting where, there's maybe like 8 different teachers, implementing this can be hard in terms of there's a lot of people to coordinate. So I think, making sure there's the resources at the school, that there is, again, that kind of, coach and quarterback role who can help to fade in, let's say, the science teacher and then the PE teacher and things like that is just really, really important. But let's say I've seen hundreds of kids with SM. I've maybe seen dozens of teens. Like, it's that much more rare. But often the strategies really are similar. The warm-up might be watching a funny YouTube video together instead of drawing, but it's the same idea of like, let's decrease their anxiety. And then the same thing where sort of I use Spot It with teens. Little games can be okay because they sort of know it's a bit easier. So anyway, so there's a long answer, but it's complicated, but definitely very possible. But I would say the coordination is even more key.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so I'll move on to the next question. So this person is asking, I notice that often when you're speaking to a child with selective mutism, other students will say, oh, they don't talk or they don't speak. So do you have any suggestions for how to properly respond to these other students?
I can go again. I think all of us know how to answer this question. So look, it's super common. I will go out on a limb and say I've maybe never been to a school where there isn't a helpful peer that lets me know, like, oh, don't ask so-and-so, they don't talk. And there's two things that are relevant to this question. One is just the practicalities of just saying to the child, oh, thank you so much. She does know how to talk. She's working on her brave voice or things like that. But then the other piece is, especially older kids sometimes get really nervous that kids are going to bring a lot of attention to it when they speak for the first time. And that can sometimes be a deterrent for the child like starting to speak. And so if that's the case, again, with the child and family's permission, one option is to sort of talk to the class a little bit or talk to a peer before you bring them in to speak with that child, to just say, hey, how can we be a good support to our friends? We all do things that are hard. We all do things that make us nervous. And Sam is working on being brave and talking. So we can be a good friend by not making a big deal about it, by just enjoying the game. And often with that scaffolding up front, I find it goes better. And if it doesn't, if the child does pay attention and make a big deal about it, the other thing I'll do is just say to kids, you know what, it's old news really quickly. It's like if someone gets a haircut, everyone says, well, you got your haircut. And then a couple days later, it's old news. So, but I would be directive. And if you have a particularly sort of helpful peer, like sometimes there's one who's like really likes their role as the brave spokesperson, then it can be important to kind of redirect them with a new important brave role, like, oh, you're going to be the one who remembers to wait and make sure that Sally answers, so that they still feel important.
Thank you. And do you have time to squeeze in one more question for today? Great. Okay. And would you mind just going to the very last slide for those folks that do need to head off, just so they can jot down our contact information if they did want to contact the Kelty Center. So if we didn't get to your question, please feel free to email us at the Kelty Center or call us, and we would be happy to assist you in providing resources or information. So the very last question is from someone who's asking, how can I help a child that has become comfortable talking to adults, but gets very anxious talking to peers? Dr. Sally.
I'll take that one. So it's still the same process as Dr. Catchpole outlined in this talk, except the emphasis in the first step on the ladder would be fading in a peer as opposed to fading in another adult. So for example, if that child is really comfortable talking with their resource teacher, then they might go into a room as described, have the Spot It game out, have candy out, everything set up the same way. But the goal would be each session to bring in a new peer to play Spot It. And if the child didn't talk, they might whisper to the resource teacher, who would then do the repeating out loud with the praise, with the reward. And usually we have to reward all the kids playing, of course, because they'll be like, hey, why does that one get a candy and I don't? So candy gets distributed, or there's stickers in the Brave book, whichever way it may be. So the rungs on the ladder are more about bringing in more and more peers. And the focus might be the people bingo, where the child goes around at lunchtime and asks questions to kids on the playground. So it's just a little bit of a shift of who you're fading in. Whereas if they're not talking to anyone, you're fading in adults plus other kids.
Great, thank you so much. And it's 4:30 on the dot, so great timing with the questions. So thank you to all of our presenters today for this fantastic presentation. Thank you to everyone who took the time to attend today. We appreciate it so much. Again, if we didn't get to your question or if you think of one after the presentation, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Kelty Center with your question and we'll help to answer that question. And after we end the webinar today, a survey will pop up. Please, if you can spend 2 minutes just filling it out, it really does help us for future webinars. And I think that's it from our end. I hope you all have a very nice evening. Thank you for joining.